Billionaire walked in the park with his fiancée, until he saw his ex playing happily with twins. Welcome to Secrets Narrated. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. When the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10 and share what you felt along the way. And if you enjoy emotional stories filled with twists and hidden truths, make sure to follow Secrets Narrated so you don't miss the next one. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy every detail. The morning sun filtered through the towering glass windows of Harrison's penthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Everything gleamed with a sterile perfection that spoke of wealth beyond imagination, from the pristine white Italian leather sofas to the original Monet hanging casually on the far wall. Harrison Blake stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, his sharp jawline catching the light as he gazed out at the city sprawling beneath him. At 38, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that made boardrooms fall silent when he entered. His dark hair was impeccably styled, his gray eyes held the calculating intelligence that had built his tech empire, and his 6'2" frame was wrapped in a custom-tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. But this morning, the billionaire CEO of Verde Technologies felt hollow. "Harrison, darling, are you ready?" Victoria Ashworth's perfectly manicured voice floated across the expansive living space. He turned to see his fiancée approaching, her platinum blonde hair arranged in an elegant chignon, her emerald green dress hugging her model-thin figure. Victoria was everything his family had always wanted for him: well-bred, socially connected, and appropriately ambitious. Their engagement had been celebrated on the covers of 3 different magazines. "Almost," he replied, straightening his tie with mechanical precision, "just reviewing the environmental impact reports for the Singapore project." His voice carried the slight rasp that made business rivals nervous and board members attentive. Victoria's laugh tinkled like expensive crystal. "Always working. That's what I love about you. So driven, so focused." She moved to his side, her manicured fingers adjusting his already perfect collar. "Though I do hope you'll be present for our walk. The photographer from Vanity Fair specifically requested candid shots of us being normal." Normal. Harrison almost laughed at the irony. When had his life ever been normal? Born into old money, groomed from childhood for success, educated at the finest schools, and now running a billion-dollar empire that developed sustainable technology for Fortune 500 companies. Every step had been calculated, planned, approved. "Of course," he said, offering her his arm. "Shall we?" They stepped into the private elevator that would take them down 30 floors to street level. The elevator walls were mirrored, reflecting their image back at them. The perfect power couple, everything orchestrated and polished. As they walked through the marble lobby of Harrison's building, heads turned. They always did. Security guards nodded respectfully. The concierge straightened his posture, and other residents stepped aside with mixture of awe and envy. Central Park was Harrison's suggestion, an attempt to add some authenticity to what felt like an increasingly artificial existence. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and that particular energy that made New York feel alive. "This is perfect," Victoria murmured, posing naturally as a photographer discreetly captured their walk from a distance. "The board will love seeing us like this. Stable, committed, ready for the next phase." The next phase. Their wedding was scheduled for spring, a lavish affair that would merge 2 powerful families and create what his mother called an unstoppable dynasty. Every detail had been planned by Victoria's event coordinator, from the hand-calligraphed invitations to the imported French champagne. But as they walked deeper into the park, Harrison's steps began to slow. Something was tugging at his consciousness, a memory that refused to stay buried. 4 years ago, this same park, a different season. He remembered laughter, real, unguarded laughter that had nothing to do with social positioning or strategic networking. He remembered sitting on a blanket under these same trees, sharing takeout Chinese food with someone who saw him as just Harrison, not the Blake heir, not the billionaire CEO, just a man who liked terrible action movies and could spend hours debating the ethics of artificial intelligence. "Harrison?" Victoria's voice cut through his reverie. "You've gone quiet. Everything all right?" "Yes, sorry. Just thinking about the quarterly projections." The lie came easily, too easily. They continued walking, but Harrison's mind was elsewhere. He found himself scanning the paths looking for something, someone, which was ridiculous. Maeve Collins was part of his past, a chapter he'd closed long ago, a chapter his family had made sure was closed. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Maeve's face at the charity gala, confusion turning to hurt, then to devastation as she realized what had happened. The way she'd looked at him before she ran, not angry, just broken. And he'd stood there, paralyzed by family expectations and social pressure, letting the one person who'd ever made him feel authentic slip away. "Oh, how sweet." Victoria's exclamation pulled him back to the present. Harrison followed her gaze and felt his world tilt on its axis. There, about 50 yards ahead, a woman with auburn hair was kneeling beside a playground, helping two small children onto the swings. Her hair caught the morning light, creating a halo effect that made Harrison's breath catch in his throat. She was wearing a simple cream sweater and dark jeans, nothing expensive or designer, but she moved with a natural grace that no amount of money could buy. Even from this distance, even after 4 years, Harrison knew. "Maeve, look at those adorable twins," Victoria continued, oblivious to the earthquake happening inside Harrison's chest. "They look just like their mother, don't they? Same beautiful hair. Twins." The word echoed in Harrison's mind as he watched Maeve push one child while encouraging the other. The boy had dark hair that looked almost familiar, and the little girl's laugh carried across the playground with the same musical quality that had once made Harrison's heart race. Harrison's carefully constructed world began to crumble as mathematics that had nothing to do with business profits started calculating in his mind. 4 years since they'd broken up. The children appeared to be around 3 years old, maybe a bit older, 3 years and some months old. His steps stopped entirely, causing Victoria to tug on his arm. "Harrison, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." A ghost. Maybe that's exactly what this was. The ghost of the life he'd chosen not to live, the love he'd been too weak to fight for, the man he'd been too afraid to become. As if sensing his stare, Maeve looked up from the swing set. Their eyes met across the distance, and Harrison felt 4 years collapse into nothing. She'd aged beautifully. There were tiny lines around her green eyes that spoke of laughter and maybe worry, and her face had a maturity that made her even more stunning than he remembered. But it was her expression that stopped his heart. Recognition. Then something else. Protective, almost fierce. She quickly looked away and gathered the children closer to her. "Harrison Blake, answer me," Victoria demanded, her voice sharp with the first real emotion he'd heard from her in months. But Harrison couldn't answer. He could only watch as Maeve took each child's hand and began walking quickly toward the park exit, her movements urgent, almost desperate. She didn't look back. And in that moment, Harrison understood with crystalline clarity that the hollow feeling he'd been carrying wasn't about his success or his engagement, or even his future. It was about those 3-year-old children who had Maeve's smile and what looked suspiciously like his own dark hair. It was about a woman who'd once made him feel human walking away from him again. It was about the possibility that everything he thought he knew about his life was built on a foundation of lies. "We need to go," he said abruptly, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't name. "But the photo shoot—" "Now, Victoria, we're leaving now." As they walked back toward the street, Harrison's mind raced with questions that threatened to destroy everything he'd built, everything he'd believed about his carefully curated life. And somewhere deep in his chest, a part of him that had been dormant for 4 years began to wake up. The part that had once loved Maeve Collins with a desperation that had terrified him. The part that wondered if those children were his. What secrets has Harrison been blind to for 4 years? Could Maeve really be raising his children alone, and if so, why didn't she tell him? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Harrison's hands trembled as he poured himself 3 fingers of 25-year-old Macallan. The amber liquid caught the afternoon light streaming through his office windows, but he barely noticed. His mind was still trapped in Central Park, replaying those 30 seconds that had shattered 4 years of carefully constructed denial. The Verde Technologies headquarters occupied 3 floors of Manhattan's most prestigious business district. Harrison's corner office was a shrine to success. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city, while walls displayed awards, patents, and photographs of him shaking hands with world leaders. Everything screamed power, control, achievement. Everything except the man sitting behind the mahogany desk, staring at his phone like it might explode. He'd dismissed Victoria with some excuse about an emergency board meeting. She'd been irritated but not suspicious. Work always came first in Harrison's world. What she didn't know was that the only emergency was the war raging in his chest between logic and a growing, terrifying certainty. Harrison pulled up his private investigator's contact information, then stopped. What exactly would he say? Find out if my ex-girlfriend has been hiding my children for 3 years? The very thought made him feel like a stranger to himself. Instead, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. Typing Maeve's name into a search engine. The results made his breath catch. Local entrepreneur Maeve Collins opens 4th sanctuary coffee location. Single mother builds coffee empire while raising twins. From heartbreak to success, the Maeve Collins story. His fingers hovered over the first article before clicking. A photo loaded. Maeve standing behind the counter of a warm, inviting coffee shop. Her auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun. Genuine smile lighting up her face as she served customers. She looked radiant, successful, complete. The article was from 6 months ago. Maeve Collins, 32, has built something remarkable from the ground up. Starting with a single coffee cart after personal setbacks 4 years ago, she now owns 4 thriving sanctuary locations across Manhattan. I wanted to create spaces where people feel genuinely welcomed, says Collins, who raises 3-year-old twins Lucas and Emma as a single mother. My children taught me that love doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. Lucas and Emma. Harrison stared at the names until they burned into his retinas. 3 years old. The timeline aligned perfectly with their breakup, with that last night they'd spent together before everything fell apart. His intercom buzzed. Mr. Blake, you're 4 p.m. with the Japanese investors. Cancel it, Harrison said without looking up. Cancel everything today. Sir, but they flew in specifically. I said cancel it, Jennifer. His voice carried an edge that made his assistant's protests die instantly. Harrison scrolled through more articles, his heart pounding harder with each detail. A business feature mentioned Maeve's fierce independence and how she'd started her company with no outside investors or family money. Another piece praised her for hiring single mothers and offering on-site childcare. She'd built a life, a successful, meaningful life without him, and she'd done it while raising children who might be. His phone rang. Victoria's name flashed on the screen. Harrison, darling, I've been thinking about this morning. You seemed so distracted. Is everything all right with the Singapore deal? Everything's fine, Victoria. The lie tasted like ash. Good. Because I've moved our dinner with Mother to tomorrow instead. She wants to discuss the wedding flowers again. Victoria's voice carried the particular tone she used when managing his social calendar like a military operation. Their wedding. Harrison stared out at the city skyline, trying to imagine walking down the aisle with Victoria while somewhere in this same city, Maeve was reading bedtime stories to children who might have his eyes, his stubborn streak, his. Harrison, are you listening? Of course, wedding flowers, tomorrow. Perfect. Oh, and I booked us that couples therapy session Dr. Whitmore suggested, just to ensure we're aligned before the big day, next Thursday at 3. Couples therapy. To align them like business partners preparing for a merger, which, Harrison realized with startling clarity, was exactly what their relationship was. I have to go, Victoria. But, Harrison hung up and immediately opened a new browser tab. His fingers moved with sudden determination as he searched for the address of Maeve's flagship coffee shop. 20 minutes later, Harrison stood across the street from Sanctuary Coffee, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the large windows, he could see warm lighting, comfortable seating areas, and walls lined with local artwork. It looked nothing like the sterile perfection of his usual haunts. It looked like home, and there she was. Maeve moved behind the counter with easy confidence, her auburn hair now loose around her shoulders, wearing a simple green sweater that brought out her eyes. She was laughing with an employee, her whole face lighting up in a way that made Harrison remember why he'd fallen so hard, so fast, 4 years ago. A small area near the back caught his attention, a children's corner with tiny tables, coloring books, and toys. 2 car seats sat empty near a table where homework was spread out, as if children had been there recently but were now elsewhere. His children. The thought hit him like a physical blow. He gripped the lamppost beside him, struggling to breathe as the full weight of possibility crashed over him. If those children were his, then Maeve had been alone through pregnancy, through birth, through every first moment he should have been there for. And it was his fault. The memory of that night 4 years ago came rushing back with brutal clarity. His family's charity gala, an event Maeve had been nervous about attending but had agreed to because she loved him. He'd promised to stay by her side, promised she wouldn't have to face his mother's crowd alone. But then Charles Worthington had cornered him about the merger, and Helena Morrison had insisted on introducing him to potential investors, and before he knew it, an hour had passed. When he'd finally looked for Maeve, someone had told him she'd left after making quite a scene. He'd found her crying in his apartment later, her designer dress, one she'd saved for months to buy, stained with what looked like red wine. She'd been shaking, trying to explain something about his mother's friends, about humiliation, about wine being poured over her head. But he'd been distracted, stressed about the merger, and when his mother called to tell him how embarrassed the family was by Maeve's outburst, he'd believed the wrong person. He'd chosen family loyalty over the woman he loved, and Maeve had walked away that night with a look in her eyes that should have told him everything, the look of someone whose trust had been shattered beyond repair. Now, watching her through the coffee shop window, Harrison saw the woman she'd become without him. Strong, independent, successful, a mother. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Don't forget, dinner with mother is at Le Bernardin, 7:30 sharp. Wear the navy Armani." Harrison stared at the message, then at Maeve laughing with her customers, then at the empty car seats that spoke of children who might carry his DNA but didn't know his name. For 4 years he'd told himself he'd made the right choice. Family stability over uncertain love, predictable partnership over passionate chaos, security over risk. But standing here now, Harrison realized he'd made the most catastrophic mistake of his life, and he had no idea how to fix it, or if it was even possible to try. A small girl with auburn curls suddenly appeared at Maeve's side, tugging on her sweater. Maeve's face transformed with such pure, radiant love that Harrison felt his knees buckle. The little girl looked up at Maeve with eyes that Harrison recognized, because he saw them in his own mirror every morning. His daughter, who didn't know him, his daughter who had learned to walk and talk and laugh without him, his daughter who called only Maeve Mama, because that's all she'd ever known. Harrison Blake, billionaire, tech mogul, master of the universe, stood on a Manhattan sidewalk and felt his entire world crumble into dust, because for the first time in his life, money couldn't fix what he'd broken, and love might no longer be enough. Maeve Collins had always been able to sense when she was being watched. It was a skill she developed as a child, growing up in foster homes where survival meant staying aware of your surroundings. But the feeling that had been crawling up her spine for the past 20 minutes was different, heavier, more familiar, more dangerous. She glanced up from the espresso machine where she was training her newest hire, Sophia, and caught a glimpse of a tall figure across the street. Her blood turned to ice. Harrison Blake stood beneath the streetlight like a ghost from her carefully buried past, his expensive suit making him look as out of place in her neighborhood as a diamond in a coal mine. Even from this distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands hung at his sides like he didn't know what to do with them. 4 years. 4 years of building a life where that face didn't haunt her dreams, where those gray eyes didn't make her chest tight with longing and regret. 4 years of telling herself she'd made the right choice. "Mama?" Emma's small voice cut through her panic. Her daughter, their daughter, stood beside her, auburn curls bouncing as she looked up with eyes that were unmistakably Harrison's. "Can I have my juice box now?" Maeve's heart clenched. Emma had Harrison's eyes, but she had Maeve's chin and that stubborn set to her jaw that appeared whenever she wanted something. Lucas was waiting at their corner table, his dark hair falling into his face as he concentrated on his coloring book, completely unaware that his biological father was standing 50 feet away. "Of course, sweetheart," Maeve managed, her voice steadier than she felt. She grabbed Emma's juice box from behind the counter, but her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. "Miss Maeve, are you okay?" Sophia asked, her young face creased with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." A ghost. That's exactly what Harrison was. A beautiful, devastating ghost of the woman she used to be. The woman who'd believed in fairy tales and happily ever afters. The woman who'd thought love could conquer anything, even family disapproval and social pressure. That woman had died the night Harrison's family humiliated her so completely that she'd understood with crystal clarity exactly where she stood in his world. "Nowhere. I'm fine," Maeve lied, forcing a smile as she handed Emma her juice box. "Just tired. It's been a long day." But as Emma skipped back to Lucas, Maeve's composure cracked. She could feel Harrison's stare like a physical weight, could sense his confusion and, worse, his growing realization, because Emma looked like him. God help them both. She looked exactly like him. The bell above the door chimed and Maeve's heart stopped, but it was just Mrs. Patterson from down the street, coming in for her usual afternoon latte. "Maeve, dear, you look pale," Mrs. Patterson said, settling her purse on the counter. "Are you feeling all right?" "Perfect," Maeve said, grateful for the distraction as she began preparing Mrs. Patterson's drink. "How was your doctor's appointment?" But even as she went through the motions, grinding beans, steaming milk, making conversation, her mind was racing. Harrison was still out there. And if he was here, if he'd found her coffee shop, then he knew. Or at least, he was starting to piece things together. The timeline, the children's ages, Emma's eyes. "Lucas, Emma," she called softly. "Time to pack up. We need to go home and start dinner." Lucas looked up from his coloring, dark eyebrows scrunched in the same expression Harrison made when he was concentrating. "But I'm not finished with my dragon, Mama. You can finish it at home, baby." Maeve's voice carried a note that made both children look at her more carefully. They'd learned to read her moods, these two. Growing up with a single mother had made them sensitive to shifts in her emotional weather. "Mama sad?" Emma asked, abandoning her juice box to wrap her small arms around Maeve's legs. The simple gesture nearly broke her. These children, her children, had never known a father's love because she'd made the choice to protect them from a man who'd already proven he'd choose family loyalty over her heart. A man who'd stood by while his mother's friends poured wine over her head and called her inappropriate for their circles. But looking at Emma's concerned face, at Lucas gathering his crayons with careful precision, Maeve felt the weight of that choice like never before. Had she been protecting them, or had she been protecting herself? "Mama's not sad," she said, kneeling to pull Emma close. "Mama just loves you both so much." "Love you too, Mama," Emma said solemnly, pressing her face against Maeve's neck. Through the window, Harrison was gone. Maeve should have felt relief. Instead, she felt something that might have been disappointment, which made her hate herself a little more. 30 minutes later, Maeve unlocked the door to her apartment, a cozy two-bedroom space above a bakery that smelled perpetually of cinnamon and fresh bread. It wasn't the penthouse suite Harrison probably lived in, but it was theirs. Safe, warm, full of laughter and bedtime stories and the kind of love that didn't come with conditions. "Bath time," she announced, trying to inject normalcy into her voice. But as she ran water for the twins and helped them out of their clothes, Maeve caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. She looked older than her 32 years. Stress lines around her eyes that spoke of long nights building her business while raising children alone. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her sweater was stained with coffee and Emma's juice box, and she wore the kind of exhaustion that came from being everything to everyone all the time. Not exactly the polished perfection Harrison was probably used to now. The thought made her angry. At him, at herself, at the whole impossible situation. She'd made her choice 3.5 years ago when the pregnancy test showed 2 pink lines, and she'd realized she was carrying twins. Harrison's twins. She could have told him. Should have, maybe. But the memory of that charity gala was still too fresh. The humiliation, too raw. His mother's friend, Patricia Worthington, pouring a full glass of red wine over her head, while the crowd watched in shocked silence. The laughter that followed. The way Harrison had found her later and asked why she'd made such a scene, instead of asking why she was covered in wine and shaking with humiliation. He'd believed them over her, chosen their version of events over her truth. That night, Maeve had understood that love wasn't enough when it wasn't backed by trust, by protection, by the simple act of choosing your partner over everyone else when it mattered most. So she'd chosen differently. She'd chosen her unborn children's emotional safety over their right to know their father. "Mama, you're squeezing too tight," Lucas said, his voice muffled against her shoulder as she helped him into his pajamas. "Sorry, baby." She loosened her grip, pressing a kiss to his dark hair that was exactly the same shade as Harrison's. After the children were asleep, Emma clutching her stuffed elephant, Lucas curled up with a picture book about dragons. Maeve sat in her small living room with a cup of tea and finally allowed herself to fall apart. Because seeing Harrison today had brought everything rushing back. The way he'd made her laugh until her sides ached. The way he'd listened to her dreams about opening her own business someday, taking them seriously when no one else ever had. The way he'd kissed her like she was precious, like she mattered, like she was enough exactly as she was. And then his world had reminded them both that she wasn't. But Emma had his eyes. Lucas had his stubborn streak and his methodical way of approaching problems. They were half him, whether she liked it or not, and now he knew they existed. Maeve's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. H." Her hands shook as she stared at the screen. 3.5 years of protecting her children, of building a life without him, and it all came down to 4 simple words. "We need to talk." The question was, did she have the courage to let him back in? Did she have the strength to risk everything she'd built for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, Harrison Blake had finally learned how to choose love over everything else? Or would she lose her children's hearts to a man who'd already proven he could break them? Harrison had never been the kind of man who paced. Pacing was for people who lacked control, who let emotions dictate their actions. But at 2:17 a.m., he found himself wearing a groove in his penthouse floor, his phone clutched in his hand like a lifeline. Maeve hadn't responded to his text. 7 hours had passed since he'd sent those 4 words that had taken him 3 drafts to get right. "We need to talk." Simple, direct, giving nothing away while asking for everything. The silence was killing him. He'd left the coffee shop after seeing Emma, his daughter, Jesus Christ, his daughter, and driven aimlessly through Manhattan until his hands stopped shaking enough to hold his phone. The private investigator he kept on retainer had taken exactly 47 minutes to confirm what Harrison's heart already knew through public records and careful observation. Lucas James Collins and Emma Rose Collins, born February 14th, 3.5 years ago. Father listed as unknown on the birth certificate. Mother, Maeve Elizabeth Collins, who according to public records had been alone during the period around their birth, Valentine's Day babies. The cosmic irony wasn't lost on him. The investigator had also provided publicly available information that made Harrison's stomach churn. Birth announcements showed Maeve had given birth during one of the worst blizzards in New York's recent history, with only a neighbor, Mrs. Chen, listed as an emergency contact in apartment building records. She'd been completely alone, while Harrison was probably at some business dinner, discussing quarterly projections and market forecasts. The woman he'd loved was bringing his children into the world by herself. No one to hold her hand. No one to tell her how proud he was, how sorry he was, how desperately he wished he could take back that terrible night that had driven her away. His phone buzzed. Harrison nearly dropped it in his haste to check the screen. "Victoria, darling, I know you're probably still working, but I couldn't sleep. Should we move the wedding to June instead of May? Mother thinks the weather will be more predictable." Harrison stared at the message as if it were written in a foreign language. Victoria was worried about wedding weather while he was discovering he was a father. The disconnect was so profound, it left him breathless. He turned off his phone without responding. Walking to his home bar, Harrison poured another whiskey and found himself staring at a photograph on the mantel. Him and Victoria at last year's Met Gala, both smiling camera-perfect smiles that revealed nothing about the people behind them. They looked like a magazine spread. Beautiful, successful, completely artificial. When had his life become so empty? The answer came to him with brutal clarity. The night he'd lost Maeve. Harrison pulled up his laptop and began typing an email to his assistant. "Jennifer, clear my schedule for the next 3 days. Cancel the Tokyo conference call, move the board meeting to next week, and postpone the merger review indefinitely. If anyone asks, tell them I'm dealing with a family emergency." Family emergency. The phrase felt both foreign and absolutely accurate. He hit send at 2:43 a.m. and immediately opened a new browser window. Sanctuary Coffee's website was elegant and welcoming, filled with photos of Maeve's 4 locations and testimonials from customers who praised the warm atmosphere and feeling of belonging. There was a section about their childcare services, a small room in each location where working parents could keep an eye on their children while enjoying their coffee. Brilliant. Maeve had built something that served her own needs as a single mother while helping other parents facing similar challenges. She'd turned her struggle into a solution. Another section caught his attention. Our mission. Maeve's photo accompanied a paragraph that made his chest tight with recognition of the woman he'd once known. At Sanctuary, we believe everyone deserves a place where they can breathe freely, without judgment or pretense. Whether you're a CEO grabbing coffee between meetings or a parent trying to work while your toddler colors at the next table, you belong here. Real connections happen when we stop performing and start being human. Stop performing and start being human. Harrison remembered the exact moment he'd fallen in love with Maeve 3 years ago. She'd been working at a small bookstore cafe near Columbia, and he'd been hiding there between meetings, tired of restaurants where everyone wanted something from him. Maeve had brought him coffee without asking what he did for a living, had recommended a book based on nothing but genuine enthusiasm, and had laughed at his terrible joke about sustainable energy being shocking. She'd seen him as just Harrison, not the Blake heir, not the billionaire, just a man who liked his coffee black and had strong opinions about dystopian novels. With her, he'd been human. At 6 a.m., Harrison made a decision that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. He dressed in jeans and a simple blue shirt, the most casual clothes he owned, and drove to the address his investigator had provided. Maeve's apartment was above Chen's bakery in a neighborhood that smelled like fresh bread and felt like actual community. Children's laughter echoed from a nearby playground, and elderly couples walked small dogs while neighbors called greetings from stoops and windows. It was everything his sterile penthouse world wasn't. Messy, imperfect, alive. Harrison sat in his car for 20 minutes before working up the courage to knock on the door marked 3B. His heart hammered against his ribs as footsteps approached from the other side. The door opened, and there she was. Maeve wore no makeup, her auburn hair falling in waves around her shoulders, and an oversized sweater that made her look younger than her 32 years. But it was her expression that stopped his breath. Raw recognition followed quickly by something that looked like fear. Harrison. His name sounded different in her voice. Careful. Guarded. Hello, Maeve. For a long moment, they just looked at each other across the threshold that separated his world from hers. She was more beautiful than he remembered, but there was a wariness in her green eyes that hadn't been there before. Life had marked her, just as it had marked him. They're sleeping, she said quietly. I know. I needed to see you. To talk. Maeve glanced back into her apartment, then stepped into the hallway, pulling the door almost closed behind her, protecting her children even now. What do you want, Harrison? The question was soft but direct. No games, no pretense. Pure Maeve. I want to understand, he said, his voice rougher than intended. I want to know why you didn't tell me. Something flickered across her face. Pain, maybe, or old anger. You really need to ask that? Yes, because those children... He stopped, struggling with words that felt too big for his mouth. They're mine, aren't they? Maeve was quiet for so long, Harrison thought she wouldn't answer. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Do you remember Patricia Worthington? The name hit him like a physical blow. Patricia, his mother's closest friend, the woman who'd been instrumental in arranging his engagement to Victoria, the social architect of his family's world. Maeve, do you remember what she said to me at your family's gala? Harrison's throat closed. Because suddenly, horribly, he did remember. Not the sanitized version his family had fed him afterward, but fragments of the truth he'd been too overwhelmed to see at the time. Maeve in her emerald dress, nervous but radiant. His promise to stay by her side. The hour that had stretched into 2 while he'd been pulled into business discussions. And then finding her later destroyed, looking at him like he'd betrayed her, which he had. She told me I was charming for someone from my background, and suggested I might be more comfortable at the staff entrance, he said, the words tasting like poison, in front of half the room. While you were networking, Maeve continued, her voice steady but her hands shaking. She made sure everyone understood exactly where I stood in their world. The looks, Harrison. The whispers. The way conversations stopped when I approached groups. I spent 2 hours being systematically excluded while you were discussing quarterly projections. Harrison felt sick. Why didn't you tell me? I did tell you. The words exploded out of her with 4 years of suppressed fury. I came home crying and humiliated and tried to explain what happened, and you asked me why I'd made such a scene. The memory hit him like a sledgehammer. Her tear-streaked face, his impatience, the way he'd dismissed her pain, because his mother had already poisoned him against her version of events. You chose them, Maeve said, her voice breaking. Without even asking for my side of the story, you chose them. So when I found out I was pregnant a month later, I chose my children. Harrison leaned against the hallway wall, the full weight of his failure crushing down on him. I'm sorry. God, Maeve, I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't give me back 3.5 years of raising your children alone, she said, tears finally spilling over. Sorry doesn't take away the humiliation of being treated like an intruder at your family's event. Sorry doesn't explain to Lucas why his drawing of my family only has 2 people in it. Each word was a knife to his chest. But Harrison took them because he deserved every one. You're right, he said finally. I failed you. I failed them. I failed the man I wanted to be. He looked up, meeting her eyes. But I'm here now and I want to try to be better. I want to know my children. Maeve wiped her eyes, studying his face like she was looking for lies. And Victoria? She asked quietly. The question hit him like ice water. Victoria, who was probably planning their June wedding while he stood in a hallway discovering he was already a father. I don't know, Harrison admitted. I honestly don't know. It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said in years. Mama? The small voice from inside the apartment made both Harrison and Maeve freeze. Through the barely cracked door, they could hear tiny footsteps padding across hardwood floors. Mama, I had the dragon dream again. Maeve's face transformed with instant maternal concern. I'll be right there, baby, she called softly, then turned back to Harrison with something that looked almost like panic. You need to go. But before either of them could move, the door swung open wider, and Harrison found himself face to face with his son. Lucas stood in the doorway wearing dinosaur pajamas, his dark hair sticking up in impossible directions, clutching a well-loved stuffed dragon. His eyes, Harrison's own gray eyes, were wide with sleep and confusion as he looked between his mother and the strange man in their hallway. Who's that? Lucas asked, his voice carrying that particular directness that only 3-year-olds possessed. Harrison felt like his heart might stop. This was his child, his son, standing 3 feet away with bedhead and brave eyes, protecting his mother even in his confusion. This is... Maeve hesitated, and Harrison could see the war playing out across her face. 4 years of careful protection versus the reality standing in their hallway. This is Harrison. He's an old friend of Mama's. Lucas studied Harrison with the serious intensity he'd clearly inherited from both parents. Are you staying for breakfast? Mama makes really good pancakes on Saturdays. The innocent question hit Harrison like a physical blow. Breakfast. Such a simple thing, sharing Saturday morning pancakes with his children, and yet something he'd never even known he'd lost. Harrison found himself at a complete loss for words. He'd negotiated billion-dollar deals, given presentations to world leaders, commanded boardrooms full of the most powerful people in business, but faced with his 3.5-year-old son asking about pancakes, he was helpless. Lucas, baby, go back to bed, Maeve said gently. It's still very early. But I'm hungry, Lucas protested, then looked directly at Harrison again. Are you hungry too? There was something in the way Lucas asked. Not demanding or manipulative, just genuinely concerned about Harrison's well-being, that made Harrison's throat close with emotion. This child, who had every reason to be wary of strangers, was worried about feeding him. Lucas James Collins, came another small voice from inside the apartment. You woke me up. Emma appeared beside her brother, her auburn curls an absolute disaster, and her unicorn pajamas twisted around her small frame. But it was her face that made Harrison's world tilt. She had his eyes, but her expression was pure Maeve, that particular combination of stubbornness and sweetness that had first made him fall in love. Who's the tall man, Mama? Emma asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Harrison knelt down, bringing himself to their eye level. The movement was instinctive, something he'd never done with any other children but felt completely natural with these two small people who shared his DNA. Hi, Lucas. Hi, Emma, he said, his voice softer than he'd ever heard it. I'm Harrison. Emma cocked her head to one side, studying him with the intensity of someone much older. You have the same eyes as me and Lucas. The observation was so matter-of-fact, so completely innocent, that it nearly destroyed him. Of course she'd noticed. Children saw things adults spent years trying to hide. Emma, Maeve warned quietly. But Emma wasn't finished. She stepped closer to Harrison, close enough that he could smell her baby shampoo and see the faint freckles across her nose. Freckles that looked exactly like the ones he'd had as a child. Are you our daddy? She asked with the devastating directness that only a 3-year-old could manage. The silence that followed felt like it lasted for hours. Harrison looked up at Maeve, whose face had gone completely white, then back at Emma's expectant expression. Emma, sweetheart, Maeve started. It's okay, Harrison said quietly. He looked directly into Emma's eyes, his eyes, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. Yes, I think I am. Lucas stepped closer, his dragon clutched tighter against his chest. Where have you been? The question was asked without accusation, just pure curiosity. But it hit Harrison harder than any boardroom confrontation ever had. Where had he been? Living in a glass tower, making money, planning a wedding to a woman who saw him as an acquisition, while his children were learning to walk, to talk, to be brave in the world without him. I've been lost, Harrison admitted, but I'd like to not be lost anymore, if that's okay with you. Emma reached out and patted his cheek with her small hand. Mama says when we're lost we just have to ask for help. Your mama is very smart, Harrison said, his voice rough with emotion. The smartest, Lucas agreed solemnly. She knows everything. She can fix anything that's broken. Harrison's eyes found Maeve's over the children's heads. She was crying silently, her hand pressed over her mouth as she watched her children, their children, meet their father for the first time. Can you fix yourself? Emma asked Harrison with that peculiar wisdom that small children sometimes possessed. I don't know, Harrison answered honestly, but I'd like to try. Emma nodded as if this was a perfectly reasonable answer. Mama says trying is the most important part. She's right about that too. Lucas had been studying Harrison throughout this exchange, and now he stepped even closer. Do you know about dragons? A little, Harrison said. Tell me about yours. Lucas's face lit up as he held up his stuffed dragon. This is Spark. He's brave and he protects people from nightmares. I had a scary dream, but Spark helped. What was the dream about? There was a man who was supposed to love me, but he went away, Lucas said with matter-of-fact sadness. And I couldn't find him anywhere and Mama was crying. Harrison felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Even in sleep, his son was wrestling with abandonment he didn't understand. But it was just a dream, Lucas continued. Mama says dreams aren't real, but sometimes they feel real. Sometimes they do, Harrison agreed. But you know what's real? Spark protecting you, and your mama loving you, and, he took a shaky breath, and me being right here, right now. Emma had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement. Suddenly, she grabbed Harrison's hand with her tiny fingers. You should stay for pancakes, she announced. Mama makes them in fun shapes. Mine are always butterflies and Lucas always wants dragons. Harrison looked at Maeve, who was still standing frozen in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. Maeve, he asked quietly. She wiped her eyes, looking between him and their children. These beautiful, perfect children who were asking their father to stay for breakfast like it was the most natural thing in the world. She started, then stopped. Harrison could see her internal struggle. The mother who wanted to protect them warring with the part of her that had once loved him enough to risk everything. Please, Mama, Emma asked. He seems nice, and he has the same eyes as us. Lucas nodded seriously. Maybe he won't go away if we feed him pancakes. The simple logic broke something inside Harrison. These children, who had never had a father, were willing to trust him based on nothing but shared eye color and their own generous hearts. Okay, Maeve said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Okay, pancakes. Emma cheered and immediately began pulling Harrison toward the apartment. Come see my room. I have a castle bed. But Lucas hung back, still clutching his dragon, studying Harrison with those serious gray eyes. Are you going to stay this time? He asked quietly. The question contained the weight of every bedtime story Harrison had missed, every scraped knee he hadn't kissed better, every daddy look he'd never heard. I'm going to try very hard to stay, Harrison said, kneeling down again to meet Lucas's gaze. Would that be okay with you? Lucas considered this with the gravity of someone much older, then nodded. Spark thinks you're probably okay, and Spark is usually right about people. As Harrison followed his children into their warm, lived-in apartment, so different from his sterile penthouse, he felt something he'd been missing for 4 years without even realizing it. He felt like he was coming home, but in his pocket, his phone buzzed with another message from Victoria, reminding him that coming home might mean burning down the life he'd built without them. And for the first time in his adult life, Harrison Blake thought that might be exactly what he needed to do. Harrison Blake had eaten breakfast in Michelin-starred restaurants around the world. He'd attended power brunches that shaped global policy and closed deals over champagne and caviar. But sitting at Maeve's small kitchen table, watching Emma carefully pour syrup on her butterfly-shaped pancake, while Lucas explained the complex mythology behind his dragon pancake, Harrison realized he'd never actually had breakfast before. Not like this. Not with small hands sticky with syrup reaching for his sleeve. Not with voices competing to tell him the most important things in the world, like how Emma could count to 50 in Spanish or how Lucas knew all the names of dinosaurs, even the ones with really long names that most grown-ups couldn't say. That one's a Carnotaurus, Lucas explained seriously, pointing to a picture in the dinosaur book he'd retrieved from his room. It has horns like a bull, but it's actually a meat eater. Most people think horns mean plant eater, but they're wrong. I didn't know that, Harrison said, and meant it. When was the last time he'd learned something that wasn't related to profit margins or market trends? Lucas knows everything about dinosaurs, Emma said proudly, then turned to Harrison with syrup on her chin. What do you know everything about? The question stopped Harrison cold. What did he know everything about? Making money? Building companies? Disappointing people who mattered? I'm good with computers, he said finally. I help make technology that's better for the environment. Emma's face lit up. Like recycling? Sort of. More like finding ways to use less electricity or make cleaner energy. That's important, Lucas said solemnly. Mama says we have to take care of the earth because it's the only one we have. Of course, Maeve would teach them about environmental responsibility. Harrison glanced at her where she stood by the stove, supposedly washing dishes but clearly listening to every word of their conversation. She'd been quiet since inviting him in, letting the children lead while she watched with an expression he couldn't quite read. Mama, come sit with us, Emma called. Harrison is telling us about his job. Maeve dried her hands slowly, then moved to the table, taking the chair across from Harrison. This close, he could see the faint circles under her eyes that spoke of too many late nights building her business while raising children alone. But he could also see the contentment in her face as she watched Lucas and Emma, the quiet pride of a woman who'd created something beautiful from nothing. Tell them about the solar panels, Maeve said quietly. Harrison looked at her in surprise. She remembered. Of course she remembered. 4 years ago, he'd been obsessed with developing more efficient solar technology, staying up nights working on prototypes in his home lab. He'd shared those dreams with her during long conversations over takeout Chinese food, back when she was the only person who listened to his ideas without calculating their profit potential. Well, Harrison said, turning back to the twins, you know how plants use sunlight to grow? Both children nodded attentively. My company makes special panels that work like plant leaves. They catch sunlight and turn it into electricity to powerhouses and schools and hospitals. Like magic? Emma asked wide-eyed. Like science, Lucas corrected her, though he looked equally fascinated. Right? Right. Science that feels a little like magic. Emma finished her pancake and immediately climbed down from her chair. I want to show you something, she announced, disappearing into what Harrison assumed was her bedroom. Lucas lingered at the table, still studying Harrison with those serious gray eyes. Did you invent the solar panels yourself? I helped. I had a whole team of very smart people working with me. Like Mama has her team at the coffee shop? Harrison felt a jolt of recognition. Exactly like that. Emma returned carrying a drawing that she thrust proudly at Harrison. I made this yesterday at Mama's coffee shop. The drawing was in crayon, typical 3-year-old art with people that looked like stick figures, and a house that defied all laws of physics. But what made Harrison's breath catch was the family depicted. A woman with long red hair, 2 small figures with dark hair, and in the corner added in different crayon as if it were an afterthought, a tall figure with gray eyes. That's our family, Emma explained unnecessarily. Mama, me, Lucas, and... She looked up at Harrison with those devastating eyes that were exactly like his own. I drew you before I met you. Isn't that funny? Harrison's throat felt too tight to speak. This child had been dreaming of him, drawing him, creating a place for him in their family, even though she'd never seen his face. It's beautiful, he managed. You can keep it if you want, Emma offered with the casual generosity that only children possessed. Emma, honey, you don't have to give away your art, Maeve said gently. But he's in it, Emma said, as if this explained everything. It belongs to him, too. Harrison carefully folded the drawing and put it in his shirt pocket, right over his heart. Thank you. I'll treasure it. Lucas had been watching this exchange with growing thoughtfulness. Do you have a house? I do. Does it have room for kids? The question was so innocently devastating that Harrison felt like he'd been hit by lightning. His penthouse, all glass and marble and expensive emptiness, had never been designed for children. There were no safety locks on cabinets, no colorful toys scattered across Persian rugs, no small fingerprints on stainless steel appliances. It's not very good for kids right now, Harrison admitted. But it could be. Houses can change, Lucas said wisely. Mama says that's the best thing about them. You can make them better when you know better. From the mouths of babes. Harrison looked at Maeve, who was staring at her son with a mixture of pride and sadness that made Harrison's chest ache. Your mama is right about a lot of things, Harrison said. Emma climbed back onto her chair and looked between Harrison and Maeve with the calculating expression of someone planning something important. "Are you and Mama going to get married?" she asked with characteristic directness. Both adults went very still. "Emma," Maeve said carefully, "that's not how it works." "But you love each other," Emma interrupted with the confidence of someone stating an obvious fact. "I can tell." "How can you tell?" Lucas asked, curious. Emma pointed at Harrison. "He looks at Mama like Prince Eric looks at Ariel in the Mermaid movie, and Mama gets the same face she has when she looks at us." Harrison's heart stopped. Out of the mouths of babes, indeed, because Emma was right. He was looking at Maeve exactly like a man who was still desperately in love, despite 4 years and a lifetime of mistakes. And Maeve, when he caught her eye across the table, her expression was soft and vulnerable in a way that made him remember why he'd fallen for her in the first place. "It's complicated, sweetheart," Maeve said finally. "Why?" Emma asked. "Love isn't complicated. Love is just love." Harrison's phone chose that moment to ring. Victoria's name flashed on the screen, and suddenly the warm bubble of the breakfast table felt invaded by the cold reality waiting outside this apartment. "Excuse me," Harrison said, declining the call. But the damage was done. Emma had noticed the name on the screen. "Who's Victoria?" she asked with that terrible 3-year-old directness. Harrison looked helplessly at Maeve, who was staring at the phone with an expression that had gone very carefully blank. "Victoria is—" Harrison struggled for words that wouldn't hurt these innocent children while being honest about the mess he'd made of his life. "She's someone I made a promise to before I knew about you." "What kind of promise?" Lucas asked. Harrison felt like he was drowning. "How did you explain an engagement built on family expectations and social advantage to children who believed love was simple? The kind of promise that maybe I shouldn't have made," he said quietly. Emma considered this with the seriousness of a judge. "Mama says if you make a promise you can't keep, you should say sorry and try to do better. Your mama is very wise." "The wisest," Emma agreed. Then with the stunning pragmatism of childhood, she added, "So you should tell Victoria sorry and stay here with us instead." Harrison looked at Maeve, whose eyes were bright with tears she was trying not to shed in front of the children. "It's not that simple, Em," Maeve said softly. "Why not?" Emma demanded. "We're your family. Families should be together." And there it was, the truth that cut through all of Harrison's careful justifications and complicated adult reasoning. These were his children. This was his family. And he'd spent 4 years living a lie while they grew up without him. His phone rang again. Victoria, persistent as always. This time Harrison turned it off entirely. "You're right," he said to Emma, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening in his chest. Families should be together. But even as he said it, Harrison knew that wanting something and being able to make it happen were 2 entirely different things. And the life he'd built without them wasn't going to disappear just because his heart had finally figured out where it belonged. Victoria Ashworth stood in the marble entryway of Harrison's penthouse, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping her Hermes bag so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She'd used her key, the one Harrison had given her 6 months ago when their engagement became officially official, because he wasn't answering his phone. 27 missed calls. 12 unanswered texts. A fiancé who'd vanished for an entire day without explanation. "Harrison," she called, her voice echoing in the sterile space. "I know you're here. Your doorman said you came home 20 minutes ago." The penthouse felt different somehow, like someone had shifted the furniture by inches, leaving everything recognizable but somehow wrong. Victoria's designer heels clicked against the marble as she searched room by room, her anxiety building with each empty space. She found him in his home office, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows with his back to the door. He was still wearing the casual clothes she'd never seen before, jeans and a simple blue shirt that made him look younger, less controlled, more human. On his desk, she noticed a child's crayon drawing spread carefully beside his laptop. "What the hell, Harrison?" Victoria's composure cracked like expensive veneer. "I've been calling you all day. The wedding planner needs final headcount numbers. Your mother wants to know about the rehearsal dinner menu. And I had to cancel our appointment with Dr. Whitmore because my fiancé apparently vanished into thin air." Harrison turned slowly, and Victoria felt her breath catch. His face was different, softer somehow, but also devastated, like a man who'd been taken apart and hastily reassembled with pieces missing. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Those 4 words, the same ones he'd texted to someone else yesterday, made Victoria's stomach clench with sudden, terrible understanding. About what? But even as she asked, Her eyes were drawn back to that crayon drawing on his desk. Stick figures in a house. A family. About the fact that I'm not the man you think you're marrying, Harrison said. About the fact that I haven't been honest with you. With myself. With anyone. Victoria set her purse down with deliberate precision, buying time while her mind raced. In her world, a world of strategic marriages and social advantage, honesty was a luxury few could afford. But the look in Harrison's eyes wasn't about business mergers or family expectations. It was about something real, something that threatened everything. "You're scaring me," she said, and for once, her perfectly modulated voice carried genuine emotion. Harrison picked up the drawing, his fingers tracing the crayon lines like they were precious artifacts. "I have children, Victoria." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What?" "Twins. A boy and a girl. They're 3 years old and they're—" His voice caught. "They're perfect. They make pancakes shaped like butterflies and dragons, and they know everything about dinosaurs, and they drew me into their family portrait before they even knew I existed." Victoria stared at him, her mind struggling to process information that didn't fit into any category she understood. How is that possible? You would have told me. I didn't know." Harrison's laugh was bitter, broken. "For 3.5 years I didn't know I was a father because I was too much of a coward to fight for the woman I loved when it mattered. The woman I loved." Past tense but spoken with a present tense ache that made Victoria feel like she was watching her entire future crumble in real time. "Who?" she whispered, though part of her already knew. "Maeve Collins." Victoria had never heard the name before, but the way Harrison said it, like a prayer, like an apology, like a wound that had never properly healed, told her everything she needed to know. "The woman from 4 years ago," she said slowly. "The one your mother said was completely inappropriate. The one who caused that scene at the charity gala. She didn't cause anything." Harrison's voice hardened. "My mother's friends humiliated her while I was too distracted by business to protect her. They poured wine over her head and laughed while she cried. And when she tried to tell me what happened, I believed them instead of her." Victoria felt something cold settle in her stomach. She remembered that gala. Remembered the whispered gossip about some unsuitable girl who'd had too much to drink and embarrassed the Blake family. She'd been dating someone else at the time, but Harrison's sudden availability had been noted by every social climbing family in Manhattan. "And now she's back," Victoria said. "It wasn't a question. She never left. She's been here the whole time, building a life, raising our children, becoming the woman I always knew she could be." Harrison turned back to the window, but Victoria could see his reflection. Raw, broken, completely changed from the controlled man she'd agreed to marry. "They think I look at her the way Prince Eric looks at Ariel." "Who thinks that?" "Emma. My daughter. She's 3 years old and she sees things more clearly than I have in 4 years." Victoria felt her carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. Their engagement wasn't some grand love story. She'd always known that. It was a merger of compatible lives, shared social circles, mutual benefit. She'd loved Harrison in the way one loved a beautiful piece of art or a well-designed dress, appreciating his perfection while remaining fundamentally separate from it. But seeing him like this, wrecked and human and desperately in love with someone else, made her realize something she'd never admitted to herself. She'd never loved him at all. "So what happens now?" she asked, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. Harrison turned back to face her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked completely honest. "I don't know. I know I can't marry you. I know I've spent 4 years living the wrong life. I know those children deserve better than a father who abandoned them before they were even born. And Maeve? Does she want you back?" Harrison's face crumpled with uncertainty. "I don't know that either. I hurt her badly, Victoria. I chose family approval over defending the woman I loved, and she spent 3 years building a life that doesn't need me. I might be too late." Victoria walked to the window, standing beside him as they both looked out at the city sprawling below. Somewhere out there were Harrison's children, her replacement before she'd even known she was being replaced. "Your mother is going to be livid," she said finally. "Yes. The wedding planning committee will have a collective nervous breakdown. Probably. Vanity Fair will want to know why the engagement is off. I don't care." Victoria studied his profile. The strong jaw, the aristocratic features, the careful breeding that made him such a perfect match on paper. He was still handsome, still wealthy, still everything her family had wanted for her. He was also completely, irrevocably, in love with someone else. "I should be furious," she said quietly. "I should throw this ring at your head and storm out in a dramatic rage. Why don't you?" Victoria looked down at her engagement ring, a flawless 3-carat diamond that had been featured in Town and Country magazine. It was beautiful, valuable, completely soulless. Because I've never seen you look the way you looked when you talked about those children, she admitted. And because maybe I deserve someone who looks at me the way you look at her. She slipped the ring off her finger and placed it on the windowsill between them. For what it's worth, she said. I hope you're not too late. Harrison turned to stare at her, something like gratitude mixed with his devastation. Victoria, don't. She held up a hand. Don't apologize or try to make this easier. Just try to be the father those children deserve, and maybe figure out how to deserve the woman who raised them alone. She picked up her purse and walked toward the door, then paused. Harrison, that woman at the gala, I remember her now. She looked completely out of place the whole night until someone helped her leave early. I always wondered what happened to her. Now you know. Now I know. Victoria straightened her shoulders, armor sliding back into place. Goodbye, Harrison. I hope your children like having a billionaire for a father. Though something tells me they'd love you just the same if you were broke. As the elevator doors closed behind Victoria, Harrison was left alone in his pristine penthouse with a child's drawing, and the terrifying realization that he'd just burned down his entire life, and he had no idea if Maeve would let him build something new from the ashes. The Sanctuary Coffee flagship location was unusually busy for a Tuesday afternoon. Maeve moved through the controlled chaos with practiced ease, calling out orders while keeping one eye on Lucas and Emma, who were coloring at their corner table while she worked. This was their routine. The children stayed close where she could see them, and customers had grown fond of the twins who occasionally helped distribute napkins or shared fascinating dinosaur facts. But today felt different. Maeve couldn't shake the memory of yesterday morning. Harrison sitting at her kitchen table looking at their children like he was seeing the sun for the first time. The way Emma had climbed into his lap to show him her drawings. The way Lucas had quietly shared his most precious possession, letting Harrison hold Spark the dragon. The way Harrison had looked at her across the table, like she was still the woman he'd fallen in love with 4 years ago. Miss Maeve, Emma's voice cut through her reverie. Someone important is coming. Maeve looked up from the espresso machine to see Emma pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the street. Emma had inherited Maeve's ability to sense when something significant was approaching, a gift that had served them both well over the years. The bell above the door chimed, and Maeve's heart stopped. Harrison entered, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood an elegant woman with silver hair arranged in a perfect chignon, wearing a cream-colored Chanel suit that probably cost more than Maeve's monthly rent. Everything about her screamed old money, power, and the kind of social authority that could destroy people with a well-placed word. Helena Blake, Harrison's mother, the woman who'd orchestrated Maeve's humiliation 4 years ago, who'd made it clear that someone like Maeve would never be suitable for someone like Harrison. The coffee shop's cheerful atmosphere seemed to freeze. Conversations quieted as other customers sensed the sudden tension, the way predators recognize when something dangerous has entered their territory. Maeve, Helena's voice was cultured, controlled, carrying the particular brand of condescension that only came from generations of inherited superiority. May we speak privately? Lucas looked up from his coloring book, his young face immediately registering the change in the room's energy. Emma, still by the window, moved closer to her brother with the instinctive protectiveness of someone who'd learned to read dangerous moods. There's nothing you need to say to me, Maeve replied, her voice steady, despite the way her hands had begun to shake. She'd built this life specifically to avoid people like Helena Blake, to create a world where her worth wasn't determined by bloodlines or bank accounts. Oh, but there is. Helena moved deeper into the coffee shop with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied access to any space she chose to occupy. Her eyes swept over the warm, lived-in atmosphere with poorly concealed disdain. You see, my son has gotten some rather dramatic ideas about family obligations, and while I'm sure this situation is beneficial for someone in your position, I'm here to offer you a more practical solution. Harrison stepped forward, his face dark with warning. Mother, don't. But Helena continued as if he hadn't spoken, her attention fixed entirely on Maeve. I'm prepared to offer you $2 million, a trust fund for the children's education naturally, plus a comfortable living allowance for you. In exchange, you'll relocate, somewhere pleasant, perhaps Seattle or Portland, and allow Harrison to visit the children on a reasonable schedule. The offer hit Maeve like a physical blow. $2 million. More money than she'd ever imagined having. Financial security for Lucas and Emma. College funds. A house with a yard. Everything she'd been working toward for years handed to her on a silver platter. All she had to do was disappear. Mother. Harrison's voice carried a warning that made several customers look up from their laptops. What I'm offering, Helena continued, is a chance for everyone to maintain their dignity. The children receive financial support. You're freed from the burden of raising them alone, and Harrison can fulfill his obligations without destroying his reputation. Emma had moved from the window to stand beside Lucas's chair, both children watching the adult conversation with the confused awareness of people too young to understand the words but old enough to recognize cruelty. Mama? Emma's voice was small, uncertain. Who's the mean lady? The simple question shattered something inside Maeve. Emma, her brave, innocent daughter, had immediately recognized Helena Blake for exactly what she was. A mean lady. Someone who hurt people because she could. $2 million, Helena repeated as if Emma hadn't spoken. Think about what that could mean for their future. Private schools, the best universities, opportunities you could never provide on a barista's salary. She's not a barista, Harrison said, his voice deadly quiet. She owns 4 successful businesses and employs 37 people. She's built something remarkable from nothing while you've spent your entire life spending money other people earned. Helena's composure cracked slightly. Harrison, you're being ridiculous. You have responsibilities. Yes, I do. He cut her off. To my children. To the woman I should have defended 4 years ago when you and your friends humiliated her for the crime of loving me. The coffee shop had gone completely silent. Even the espresso machine seemed to have stopped hissing, as if the entire space was holding its breath. Maeve looked at Harrison, really looked at him. Yesterday he'd been vulnerable, uncertain, a man discovering fatherhood in her kitchen over butterfly pancakes. Today he was someone she'd never seen before, a man willing to publicly break with his family to defend her. 4 years too late, maybe. But here, the answer is no, Maeve said quietly. Helena's perfectly penciled eyebrows rose. I beg your pardon? The answer is no. Maeve's voice grew stronger with each word. You can't buy my children. You can't buy me. And you certainly can't buy your way out of the consequences of raising a son who was too afraid to choose love over your approval. How dare you— Mama, Lucas interrupted, his small voice cutting through Helena's outrage. He'd been quietly listening, and now he stood up from his chair with the particular dignity that seemed to come naturally to him. Is she trying to take us away? The question hung in the air like a blade. Lucas, serious, thoughtful Lucas, had understood exactly what Helena was offering. Money in exchange for his family's destruction. No, baby, Maeve said, kneeling to his level. No one is taking you anywhere. You and Emma are staying right here with me. Good, Lucas said solemnly. Then he looked directly at Helena with those devastating gray eyes that were exactly like Harrison's. My mama doesn't need your money. She takes care of us just fine. Emma nodded emphatically. We don't want to live somewhere else. We like our dragon pancakes. Helena stared at the children, her grandchildren, with an expression that might have been confusion, as if she'd never encountered children who valued love over money, security over status. This is absurd, she said finally. Harrison, you cannot possibly be considering throwing away everything we've built for this family, Harrison finished. My family. He moved to stand beside Maeve and the children, and for the first time in 4 years, Maeve felt like someone was choosing her. Not reluctantly, not apologetically, but completely. I'm done living the life you planned for me, Harrison continued. I'm done pretending that money and status matter more than love. I'm done being the son you wanted instead of the father my children need. Helena Blake, matriarch of Manhattan society, stood in the middle of Sanctuary Coffee looking for the first time in decades like someone who'd lost control of a situation. You'll regret this, she said finally, her voice thin with rage and disbelief. When the novelty wears off and reality sets in, you'll realize what you've thrown away. I already know what I threw away, Harrison said quietly. 4 years of my children's lives. 4 years of watching the woman I love build something beautiful without me. The only thing I regret is that it took me so long to realize that everything I thought I wanted was keeping me from everything I actually needed. Helena looked between Harrison and Maeve, then at the children who were watching her with the frank assessment of people who'd already decided she wasn't worth their time. This isn't over, she said finally. Yes, Maeve said, standing up to her full height. It is. After Helena left, The coffee shop remained silent for a long moment. Then Emma tugged on Harrison's hand. "Is the mean lady gone forever?" she asked. Harrison knelt down to Emma's level, then looked at Lucas, who was still standing protectively near his sister. "She's gone," he said simply, "and she's never going to hurt any of us again." "Promise?" Lucas asked. "Promise." Emma studied Harrison's face with the seriousness of someone conducting an important interview. "Are you staying with us now? For real staying?" Harrison looked up at Maeve, his eyes full of hope and terror and love so deep it made her chest ache. "If your mama will let me," he said, "I'd like to try." And for the first time in 4 years, Maeve Collins smiled at Harrison Blake without reservation, without fear, without the weight of old wounds between them. "I think," she said softly, "we'd like that too." Outside, Helena Blake's limousine pulled away from the curb, carrying with it the last remnants of Harrison's old life. Inside, a family began to believe they might actually have a future together. 3 weeks had passed since Helena Blake's dramatic exit from Sanctuary Coffee, and Harrison was slowly discovering that becoming a father wasn't something you could master overnight, no matter how many boardrooms you'd conquered or billion-dollar deals you'd closed. Every day brought new challenges, new mistakes, and small victories that felt more meaningful than any corporate achievement ever had. "No, Daddy, you're doing it wrong," Emma informed him with the patience of someone who'd been trying to teach him proper crayon technique for the better part of an hour. "Dragons don't wear princess crowns. They wear dragon crowns." Harrison looked down at his latest artistic attempt, still awkward after weeks of practice, and realized she was absolutely right. His dragon looked confused, like it had wandered out of a children's book and into the wrong story entirely. "You're right," he said, erasing the offending crown for the 3rd time. "Dragon crowns are much more appropriate. Can you show me again how to draw one?" The patience required for fatherhood had been his biggest adjustment. In business, he could make decisions quickly, delegate efficiently, solve problems with resources and authority. But children operated on an entirely different timeline, with their own logic and needs that couldn't be rushed or managed like quarterly reports. They were sitting on the floor of Maeve's living room, art supplies covering every surface while Lucas worked on an elaborate Lego construction in the corner. It was Saturday afternoon, and this had become their routine. Harrison would arrive after Maeve closed the coffee shop for the weekend, bringing dinner and staying to help with baths and bedtime stories. The transition hadn't been seamless. There had been tears, mostly Emma's when Harrison had accidentally thrown away an important drawing, and once memorably his own when Lucas had his first real tantrum and Harrison had no idea how to handle it. There had been awkward moments when he'd tried to parent like a CEO, giving instructions instead of guidance, and Maeve had gently redirected him. There had been nights when he'd gone home to his penthouse feeling like he was failing at the most important job of his life. But there had also been breakthroughs, like the morning Emma had scraped her knee and run to him instead of Maeve for comfort, like the afternoon Lucas had proudly shown him a drawing of their whole family that included Harrison for the first time, like the gradual realization that love wasn't something you achieved, it was something you practiced day by day, mistake by mistake. "The trick," Emma explained, taking the crayon from his hand and adding elaborate spikes to the dragon crown, "is to make it look scary but also beautiful. Like Mama when she's really mad but trying not to show it." Harrison glanced toward the kitchen where Maeve was washing dishes, her auburn hair caught up in a messy ponytail, flour still dusting her sweater from the afternoon's baking experiment. She'd been teaching him how to make cookies with the twins, a domestic skill that had somehow never appeared on his resume despite his advanced degrees. "Your mom is always beautiful," he said quietly. Emma beamed at him. "I know. That's why you look at her like Prince Eric." 3 weeks, and Emma was still comparing him to Disney princes. Harrison had started taking it as a compliment. "Daddy," Lucas called from his corner construction site, "can you help me? This part is too hard." "Daddy." The word still hit Harrison like lightning every time one of the children said it. 3 weeks of bedtime stories, scraped knee kisses, and dinosaur fact exchanges, and he still couldn't quite believe these perfect small humans were his. He moved to sit beside Lucas, examining the Lego instruction manual that looked more complex than some of the engineering schematics he dealt with at work. "What's the problem?" he asked. "This piece," Lucas pointed to a tiny gray connector, "is supposed to attach here, but it doesn't fit. I think they gave me the wrong one." Harrison studied the diagram, then looked at Lucas's construction. His son had been following the instructions with methodical precision, but had gotten turned around somewhere in the middle. "I think I see the issue," Harrison said gently. "You've got the right piece, but it needs to go on upside down. See? The diagram shows the little notches facing down." Lucas examined both the piece and the instructions with the serious concentration of an engineer, then carefully made the adjustment. When it clicked into place perfectly, his face lit up with the kind of pure joy that Harrison was learning was one of the greatest rewards of parenthood. "It worked," Lucas announced. "Thanks, Daddy." "You're welcome, buddy." From the kitchen came the sound of Maeve's quiet laughter, and Harrison realized she'd been watching their interaction. Their eyes met across the room, and the look she gave him was warm, proud, maybe even a little fond. It was the kind of look that gave him hope. His phone buzzed with a text message. Harrison glanced at the screen and felt his stomach clench. "Board meeting moved to Monday 9 a.m. Singapore investors want to discuss your recent personal changes." Jennifer, the real world, intruding on their bubble of domestic happiness. Harrison had been dreading this, the inevitable moment when his business associates and investors would want to discuss his broken engagement, his newfound family, and what it all meant for Verde Technologies. "Everything okay?" Maeve asked, drying her hands on a dish towel as she approached. "Work stuff," Harrison said, setting his phone aside. "Nothing that can't wait until Monday." But Maeve had known him well enough 4 years ago to read the tension in his shoulders. "What kind of work stuff?" Harrison hesitated. They'd been building something fragile and new these past 3 weeks, and he didn't want to contaminate it with the complications of his corporate life. But they'd also promised each other honesty this time around. "The board wants to meet about my personal changes," he admitted. "Some of the investors are concerned about the stability implications." Maeve's face went very still. Stability implications. "They're worried that my broken engagement and sudden fatherhood might affect my decision-making. Corporate boards don't like surprises, and finding out your CEO has secret children definitely qualifies as a surprise." Emma looked up from her dragon drawing. "Are the work people mad at Daddy?" The innocent question hit both adults like a punch to the chest. Emma had learned to read adult moods with the sharp awareness of a child who'd grown up watching her mother navigate difficult situations alone. "No one's mad, sweetheart," Maeve said quickly. "Sometimes grown-ups just need to have boring conversations about boring grown-up things." "Oh," Emma considered this. "Like when you have to talk to the bank people about the coffee shop money." "Exactly like that." But Harrison could see the worry creeping into Maeve's expression, the way her protective instincts were beginning to activate. She'd spent 3 years building a life that was stable and secure for their children. The last thing she wanted was for his world to destabilize what they'd created. Lucas had abandoned his Lego castle and was watching the adults with those serious gray eyes that missed nothing. "Are you going away again?" he asked Harrison quietly. The question was asked without accusation, just the matter-of-fact concern of someone who'd learned not to count on permanence, but it broke Harrison's heart nonetheless. "No," Harrison said firmly, kneeling down to meet Lucas's gaze. "I'm not going anywhere. Sometimes daddies have to go to work meetings, but I'm not going away, okay?" Lucas studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, but if the work people try to make you leave, you should tell them we need you here." "I will," Harrison promised. "I absolutely will." That evening, after the children were asleep and Harrison was helping Maeve clean up the day's creative destruction, she finally voiced what had been bothering her since the text message. "What if they make you choose?" she asked quietly, loading paintbrushes into the dishwasher. "Choose what? The company or us?" Maeve's voice was careful, controlled, but Harrison could hear the fear underneath. "What if the board decides that being a sudden father makes you too much of a risk? What if they force you out?" Harrison stopped what he was doing and turned to face her fully. "Then I choose you. Every time, without question, I choose you and Lucas and Emma." "But Verde Technologies is your life's work." "No," Harrison interrupted. "It's my job. You three are my life's work." Maeve stared at him, and Harrison could see her struggling with the concept. For 3 years, she'd been the sole provider for their children, carrying the full weight of their financial security. The idea that someone would willingly risk their career for family probably seemed incomprehensible. "I mean it," he said, moving closer. 4 years ago, I chose my family's approval over defending you. I chose perceived stability over love. I chose wrong, Maeve, and I lost everything that mattered. He reached out to touch her face, thumb tracing the worry line between her eyebrows. "I won't make that mistake again." "What if?" There's no what if, Harrison said firmly. I have enough money saved to live comfortably for several lifetimes. Verde Technologies will survive without me if it comes to that, but I can't survive without you three. Not again. Maeve leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment as if she were absorbing his words, letting them sink into places that had been carefully guarded for years. Okay, she said finally. But Harrison, whatever happens on Monday, we'll face it together. You don't have to protect us from your world anymore. We're stronger than you think. Harrison looked at this woman who'd raised his children alone, who'd built a business from nothing, who'd survived his family's cruelty and emerged more resilient than ever. She was right. They were stronger than he'd given them credit for. Together, he agreed. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Outside, Manhattan glittered in the darkness, full of boardrooms and power plays and people who measured worth in dollars and market share. But inside Maeve's warm apartment, surrounded by children's artwork and the lingering scent of homemade cookies, Harrison had found something worth more than any corporate empire. He'd found his way home. Now he just had to convince the rest of the world that some things were worth more than stock prices and investor confidence. Some things were worth everything. The Verde Technologies executive conference room felt more intimate than the main boardroom, but no less threatening. Harrison sat across from 4 key board members, the inner circle who really controlled the company. Charles Worthington leaned forward, his expression carefully measured in the way that made Harrison's skin crawl. Harrison, we've called this meeting because we're concerned, Charles began, his voice carrying the false warmth of someone delivering bad news with a smile. The Singapore investors have been asking questions about leadership stability. Patricia Lowell nodded sympathetically. It's nothing personal, of course, but when a CEO's engagement ends unexpectedly, and there are suddenly children in the picture, she let the sentence hang delicately. It raises questions about judgment, added board member James Morrison, about priorities, about whether someone can effectively lead a multi-billion-dollar corporation while navigating such complex personal situations. Harrison felt the familiar corporate doublespeak washing over him, the way these people could deliver threats while sounding like concerned friends. My personal life doesn't affect my ability to run this company. Of course not directly, Charles agreed smoothly, but perception matters in our business. Confidence matters. And right now some of our key partners are wondering if Verde Technologies' leadership is as focused as it needs to be. Harrison looked around the smaller table at these people he'd worked with for years, people he'd considered colleagues if not friends, and realized that they would never understand. To them, Lucas and Emma weren't his children. They were complications, variables in an equation that needed to be managed. What exactly are you proposing? He asked quietly. Charles exchanged glances with Patricia before speaking. We're proposing a transition period. You'd remain as chairman naturally, but we'd bring in someone to handle day-to-day operations. Michael Hendricks has expressed interest in serving as chief operating officer with expanded authority. Michael Hendricks, Harrison's former protege, a brilliant but ruthless businessman who'd been positioning himself for more power for months. A man who saw environmental technology as a profit center rather than a moral imperative. You're suggesting I step back, Harrison said flatly. We're suggesting you focus on what you do best, Patricia replied smoothly. Strategic vision, long-term planning. Leave the operational details to someone with fewer personal obligations. Personal obligations. They were talking about his children like they were a hobby that had gotten out of hand. Harrison's phone buzzed with a text message. Without thinking, he glanced at the screen. Good luck today, Daddy. Emma drew you a superhero cape for courage. We love you. Maeve attached was a photo of Emma holding up a crayon drawing of a figure in a blue cape with Daddy, written across the chest in her careful 3-year-old handwriting. The contrast between that image, pure, innocent love, and the cold calculation around this boardroom table hit Harrison like a revelation. He looked up at the 12 faces staring at him expectantly, waiting for him to choose between his company and his family, waiting for him to prove that he was still the man they'd always known, the one who put profit above everything else. You know what? Harrison said, his voice growing stronger with each word. You're absolutely right. The board members smiled, thinking they'd won. I am distracted, Harrison continued. I am less focused on quarterly projections than I used to be. You know why? Because I've spent the last month learning what actually matters. And it isn't stock prices or investor confidence or market perception. He stood up and something in his movement made the entire room go still. It's Emma asking if the work people are mad at me because she's learned to read the worry in her mother's face. It's Lucas building Lego castles and trusting me to help him when pieces don't fit. It's Maeve Collins who built something beautiful and meaningful while you were all sitting in boardrooms congratulating yourselves for making rich people richer. Harrison, Charles started. I'm not finished. Harrison's voice carried the authority that had made him a successful CEO, but now it was powered by something deeper than ambition. You want to know about leadership stability? I'll tell you about stability. Stability is a woman who raised twins alone while building a business from nothing. Stability is children who share their toys and worry about feeding strangers. Stability is love that doesn't come with conditions or board meetings or performance reviews. He picked up his phone, thumb hovering over the screen. Verde Technologies was my father's dream, then mine. I've given it 12 years of my life, missed birthdays and holidays and everything that makes life worth living for the sake of quarterly growth. But you know what? Companies are replaceable. Children aren't. Patricia was staring at him like he'd lost his mind. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Harrison began typing as he spoke. I'm sending my resignation to the board effective immediately. Michael can have the company. He's always wanted it more than I have anyway. You're making a mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life, Charles said, his voice tight with disbelief. Harrison hit send on his resignation email, then looked around the table one last time at these people who'd never understood that some things couldn't be quantified in spreadsheets. The only mistake I'll regret, he said, is that it took me 4 years to realize that the life I thought I wanted was keeping me from the life I actually needed. He walked to the door, then paused. Oh, and Charles? Those illegitimate children you mentioned? Their names are Lucas and Emma. They're brilliant and kind and brave, and they're worth more than every dollar this company will ever make. Harrison Blake walked out of Verde Technologies for the last time, leaving behind a boardroom full of stunned executives and 12 years of building someone else's definition of success. In the elevator, his phone rang. Maeve's name on the screen made his chest tight with anticipation and terror. How did it go? She asked without preamble. I quit, Harrison said, and then started laughing. I actually quit. I walked away from everything. There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment Harrison wondered if he'd finally done something so reckless that even Maeve couldn't follow him. Then he heard her voice, warm and proud and absolutely certain. Good. When do you want to start learning how to run a coffee shop? Harrison leaned against the elevator wall, overwhelmed by the realization that he'd just traded $1 billion empire for pancake breakfasts and bedtime stories. It was the best deal he'd ever made. I love you, he said into the phone, meaning it more than he'd ever meant anything in his life. I love you too, Maeve replied. Now come home. Your children have been practicing a song they wrote about dragons and solar panels, and trust me, you don't want to miss this performance. Home. Harrison smiled as the elevator reached the ground floor. For the first time in his adult life, he knew exactly where that was. 2 years later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the newest Sanctuary coffee location, casting warm light across the bustling space that had once been an abandoned warehouse in Brooklyn. Harrison wiped down the last of the breakfast tables, his movements efficient after 2 years of learning the coffee business from the ground up, literally starting by mopping floors and learning to operate the espresso machine. Daddy, you missed a spot, Emma announced from her perch behind the counter where she was helping by organizing the napkin dispensers with the methodical precision she'd inherited from both parents. At 5 years old, Emma had appointed herself the quality control manager of all Sanctuary locations, a job she took with the seriousness of a seasoned executive. Her auburn curls were pulled back in pigtails, and she wore a miniature apron that read, Future CEO, in glittery letters, a gift from Maeve that had made Harrison laugh until he cried. Where? Harrison asked, genuinely looking for the spot he'd missed. Emma pointed with the authority of someone who'd been studying his cleaning technique for months. Right there, by the window. You always miss that one because you get distracted looking outside. She was right. Harrison did tend to pause at that particular table, not because he was daydreaming, but because the view reminded him of how far they'd all come. Through the window, he could see the community garden they'd helped establish, where Lucas spent Saturday mornings teaching other children about sustainable gardening. A 5-year-old with the passion of a seasoned environmentalist. Found it, Harrison said, giving the table an extra wipe. Thanks, Em. You're welcome. Mama says attention to detail is what makes us different from the big coffee chains. Emma had started quoting business philosophy, with the casual confidence of someone raised around entrepreneurial discussions. Last week, she'd told a customer that their brand identity was built on authentic community connections, a phrase she'd apparently absorbed from overhearing Maeve's conversation with their marketing consultant. "Speaking of Mama," Harrison said, "where is she?" "In the office with the important papers," Emma replied, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. "I think she's planning something secret. She keeps smiling at her computer and hiding the screen when I try to see." Before Harrison could investigate this intriguing development, the bell above the door chimed, and Lucas walked in holding hands with Mrs. Chen from their old neighborhood. At 5, Lucas had developed into a serious, thoughtful child who collected facts about environmental science the way other kids collected baseball cards. "Daddy, guess what?" Lucas said, his face bright with excitement. "Mrs. Chen says the recycling program we started is so good that other neighborhoods want to copy it." "That's amazing, buddy," Harrison said, kneeling to Lucas's level. "Tell me about it." Lucas launched into a detailed explanation of waste reduction percentages and community participation rates, his gray eyes, so like Harrison's own, shining with the passion that came from knowing you were making a difference in the world. Harrison listened with the complete attention he'd learned was one of the most important gifts you could give a child, remembering with sharp clarity the morning 2 years ago when he'd walked out of Verdi Technologies and into this life. He'd worried in those first uncertain weeks that he'd made a terrible mistake, that giving up his corporate empire for coffee shops and family dinners was the kind of romantic gesture that looked good in movies, but crumbled under real-world pressure. He'd been wrong about almost everything, but never more wrong than that. "Harrison?" Maeve's voice called from the office. "Can you come here for a minute and bring the kids?" Emma immediately abandoned her napkin organization project. "See? I told you she was planning something." The 3 of them trooped into the small office behind the main counter, where Maeve sat behind her desk with a laptop open and an expression that looked like she was trying very hard not to smile. "What's going on?" Harrison asked. Maeve turned the laptop screen toward them, revealing what appeared to be an architectural rendering of a building Harrison didn't recognize. "I got a call this morning," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "from a real estate developer in Portland. Apparently word has gotten out about our business model. Coffee shops with integrated childcare, sustainable practices, and community involvement. They want to partner with us to open 10 new locations across Oregon and Washington." Harrison stared at the screen, his mind racing to process what she was telling him. 10 locations, with an option for 20 more if the first expansion is successful. Maeve's professional composure cracked slightly, revealing the excitement underneath. "It would mean we could bring the sanctuary model to thousands more families, single parents who need workspace where their children are welcome, communities that want gathering spaces built around connection instead of just commerce." "That's," Harrison struggled for words. "Maeve, that's incredible. You've built something amazing. We've built something amazing," she corrected gently. "And I couldn't have gotten this far without my brilliant business partner who happens to know everything about sustainable technology and expansion financing." Emma tugged on Harrison's hand. "What does this mean?" Harrison looked down at his daughter, then at Lucas, who was studying the architectural rendering with the intensity of someone planning to build it himself someday. "It means your mama has created something so special that other people want to share it with their communities too," he explained. "It means we get to help more families have places where they feel like they belong." "Will we have to move?" Lucas asked, his voice carrying just the slightest note of worry. "No, buddy," Maeve said quickly. "This is our home. We'd travel sometimes to help set up the new locations, but Brooklyn is where we stay." Lucas nodded, satisfied, then returned his attention to the building plans. "Will they have community gardens too?" "Every single one," Harrison said, remembering the 5-year-old who'd taught him that sustainable business wasn't just about profit margins. It was about creating something that would last, something that would make the world better for the people who came after you. Emma was studying the laptop screen with the calculating expression she'd inherited from Maeve. "This is really good," she announced with the authority of someone delivering a professional assessment. "But you should make sure the children's areas have good windows. Kids like to see outside while they're coloring." "You're absolutely right," Maeve said seriously. "I'll make sure to tell the architects." That evening, after the coffee shop was closed and the children were asleep in their beds, they'd moved into a larger apartment 6 months ago, one with enough space for 2 growing children, and a father who was learning that home wasn't measured in square footage but in laughter density. Harrison and Maeve sat on their small balcony, sharing a bottle of wine, and watching the lights of Manhattan twinkle in the distance. "Are you scared?" Harrison asked, his fingers intertwined with hers. "Terrified," Maeve admitted. 2 years ago I had one coffee shop and 2 children. Now I'm looking at a multi-state expansion with my former billionaire partner, who gave up everything to learn how to steam milk properly. "I'll have you know I steam milk excellently now," Harrison protested. "Emma said my foam art almost looks like actual butterflies." High praise from our toughest critic. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching a plane trace its path across the sky, probably carrying people toward their own versions of home. "Do you ever regret it?" Maeve asked quietly. "Giving up Verde Technologies? Your mother still won't speak to you. The business magazines called you the billionaire who lost his mind. Some of your old colleagues think you've completely lost your way." Harrison considered the question seriously, the way he'd learned to consider everything since becoming a father. Did he miss the adrenaline rush of closing major deals? Sometimes. Did he miss the respect that came with commanding a boardroom full of powerful people? Occasionally. Did he miss the financial security of having more money than he could spend in several lifetimes? Not for a second. "You know what I did yesterday?" he said instead of answering directly. "What?" "I taught Emma how to make change for customers. She's 5 years old and she can calculate tips in her head. Then Lucas showed me a drawing he made of a solar-powered coffee roaster that he thinks could reduce our carbon footprint by 30%. After that, I came home to an apartment that smells like tonight's dinner instead of sterile cleaning products. And I helped my children with homework that actually matters to them." Harrison turned to face Maeve fully, taking in her face in the soft light from their kitchen window. 2 years of building a business together had added tiny laugh lines around her eyes, and a confidence to her posture that spoke of a woman who knew her worth. 2 years ago, I was the CEO of a billion-dollar company, engaged to a woman I didn't love, living in a glass tower 40 stories above the life I actually wanted. He lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Now I'm a partner in a coffee shop that's about to change how families think about community spaces. I'm engaged to the woman who's taught me that love isn't something you fit into your schedule. It's what you build your schedule around, and I live in a home where my children's artwork covers the refrigerator instead of original paintings covering the walls." "Wait," Maeve said, her voice suddenly very still. "What did you say about being engaged?" Harrison reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. Not the massive diamond that his world would have expected, but a simple band with a small stone that caught the light like captured starlight. "I said I'm engaged to the woman who saved my life by letting me into hers," he said, sliding off the small folding chair to kneel on the balcony floor. "Maeve Elizabeth Collins, you've spent 5 years showing our children that love means showing up every day, even when it's hard. You've spent 2 years showing me that the best partnerships are built on shared dreams instead of shared social circles. Will you marry me?" Maeve stared down at him, tears streaming down her face. "Harrison Blake, are you proposing to me on our balcony in your pajama pants?" "I'm proposing to you in the first place that ever felt like home," Harrison corrected. "In pajama pants because that's what real life looks like. With a ring I picked out myself instead of having an assistant handle it. For a woman who taught me that the best love stories aren't about perfect moments. They're about choosing each other through imperfect ones." "Yes," Maeve whispered. Then louder, "Yes, obviously yes." As Harrison slipped the ring onto her finger, they heard a small voice from inside the apartment. "Did Daddy finally ask Mama to marry him?" Emma called through the screen door. "Emma Rose Collins," Maeve called back, laughing through her tears. "Are you supposed to be asleep?" "I was sleeping, but then I heard talking, and I wanted to make sure you said yes because Lucas and I already planned the whole wedding." Lucas's voice joined his sister's. "We're having dragon-shaped cookies and butterfly decorations, and I wrote a poem about solar panels that I want to read during the ceremony." Harrison and Maeve looked at each other and burst into laughter, the kind of deep, joyful laughter that comes from recognizing that your life has become more beautiful than you ever imagined it could be. "Come here," Maeve called to the children. "Come see Mama's ring." Emma and Lucas tumbled onto the balcony in their pajamas, Emma immediately grabbing Maeve's hand to examine the engagement ring with the critical eye of someone who'd been anticipating this moment for months. "It's perfect," she announced. "It's not too big or too shiny, and it looks like Mama." "How does a ring look like Mama?" Lucas asked with scientific curiosity. "It's beautiful and strong and not trying to show off," Emma explained as if this were obvious. Harrison felt his throat tighten with emotion as he watched his children, their children, celebrate this moment with the unself-conscious joy of people who'd always known this was how the story was supposed to end. So, Lucas said with characteristic practicality, "When's the wedding?" "We just got engaged 30 seconds ago," Harrison pointed out. "But we've been planning it for months," Emma said. "We already know everything except the date." Maeve caught Harrison's eye over the children's heads, and he could see the same thought reflected in her expression. Somewhere along the way, these wise, wonderful children had understood their family's future before the adults had figured it out themselves. "How about next spring?" Maeve suggested. "When the community garden is in bloom so we can have the ceremony right here in the neighborhood where we built our life together." "Perfect," Emma said with satisfaction. "I'll tell Mrs. Chen tomorrow. She'll want to know so she can start planning the food." As they sat together on their small balcony, Harrison and Maeve in their folding chairs, Emma curled in Maeve's lap, Lucas leaning against Harrison's shoulder, watching the lights of the city where they'd found each other, lost each other, and found each other again, Harrison realized that some stories didn't end with riding off into the sunset. The best ones ended with staying exactly where you were, surrounded by the people who'd taught you that love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. Love was about choosing each other, every morning, for all the ordinary, extraordinary mornings still to come. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, love was about 5-year-olds who planned your wedding because they'd always known you belonged together, even when you'd forgotten it yourselves. Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. What moments from Harrison and Maeve's journey resonated most with you? Do you believe that love truly can conquer all obstacles when two people are willing to fight for it? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.